So now that we have our iAim controller set up, we're going to create iDrag controller for this for each of the eyes. So that when we rotate them, there'll be a little bit of drag on the eyelids. First, a little housekeeping. First thing I'm going to do is constrain this iAim con or constrain locator, which is the parent of all of the eye controllers. I'm going to parent constrain it to both the head joint as well as the root joint. So I'll select the head joint, shift select the root joint, and then select the iAim con last. Then select constrain, parent constraint, and leave it on its defaults with both the translate and rotate alls checked. Hit add. I'm going to set the weight of this to the head so that it follows the head. If I were to do the opposite, and we'll create a toggle for this later and set this to the root, when the head moves, it does not follow. So that's a quick local global toggle for the iAim controller. Okay, so now back to the task at hand. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a cluster for the eyelid area. I'm going to select Edit, Paint Select tool, so I can go in and quickly paint select these vertices. So basically grabbing all of the vertices around the orbit of the eye. Okay, let's swing around to the inside and select one edge loop of vertices in. Okay, I'm going to create a cluster. Create, deform, create cluster. Okay, so there we have our iAim cluster. One thing we'll notice is that this cluster, switch back to object mode, is not centered on the spherical eye. So we're going to create a secondary object for that. So I'm going to create a locator. Give it a quick name here. So iDrag cluster. I'm going to parent this onto this eye controller and zero it out so that it is centered. Let's turn on our locators here and quickly unparent it. So now I'm going to use this locator as the handle for this cluster. So that way we'll move the pivot of this cluster directly into the center of the spherical eye. So I'll do that by selecting the cluster handle, opening the attribute editor, then clicking on the cluster handle shape tab, and there's a weighted node pane here. Select that and then type in the name of the object that we want to serve as the handle, in this case this left iDrag cluster. So now this cluster handle has no effect whatsoever, whereas this locator replaces that cluster handle. Okay, so now what we're going to do is create an orient constraint using this eye offset locator to drive the orientation of this eye drag cluster. So select the eye offset locator first and the eye drag cluster locator second, and then select constrain, orient. And since they have the same orientation, there's no shift at this point. So the last step is to parent this eye drag cluster locator to the head 3 joint. Parent, it creates a group node for us. Now let's see what kind of transformations we're getting here. Okay, so you can see we're getting an odd sort of double transformation of sorts with this cluster here. What that means is we need to find this cluster and change it from, I'm guessing, non-relative to relative. There we go. So as I thought, it is set to non-relative. We're going to change this to relative. So now we can see we're getting the proper deformations. As the head moves, this cluster behaves as we expect. Now I'm going to select the eye-aim controller and move it around, getting odd deformations once again. So for this, I'm going to look to the deformation order. So select the geometry and then click on the icon, the box with the arrow pointing into it, which shows the input connections. We're going to reorder this so that the cluster is triggered before the skin cluster. So middle mouse drag on the cluster and drop it beneath the skin cluster. Now let's test this once again. Okay, and there we have the proper deformations that we want. Okay, let's return this to its default position. Select this eyeball here and then frame it. So now it's simply a matter of painting the offsets or the fall off of this cluster. So I'm going to zoom in quite a bit here. Now right mouse click on the geometry, select the paint menu, and then select cluster. Okay, so I can see I'm missing some vertices here, so I'm going to back out real quick. Select this locator once again, and then click on Deform, Edit Membership. Okay, let's select this cluster shape. Hide the eyeball here. Okay, and then shift select to add in the missing vertices. Okay. So now we'll go back to our paint menu. Once again, we can either right mouse click and then select paint cluster. Or in the deform menu, you can select deform, paint cluster weights tool. I'm opening the option box here. So with the solid brush with an opacity of 1, I'm going to lower my brush size and just start feathering these weights, starting with a very small weight value at the outside ring of the eye orbit, and then increasing as we get toward the eyeball itself. So I'm going to start with a 125. I'll start with a 0.25. So just paint this outside ring 25%. drop this down to 0.125. We want this to be a pretty subtle drag here, so the weights are going to be pretty low. And I'll just increase to 0.25. Really squeeze down my brush size. Okay, 0.5. And then 0.75. Okay, so now when we select our IM controller, you can see how we have eye drag. So I'm going to add another set of attributes onto this IAIM controller, or one attribute onto this IAIM controller that will control the amount of drag influence of this cluster. So with the IAIM controller selected, we're going to select Channels, Add Attribute. We're going to call this attribute Drag. It's going to be a float, the minimum of 0, a maximum of 1, and a default of 0. Okay, so here's our drag attribute. What we're going to do now is we're going to connect this attribute to the weight of the skin cluster, or the envelope weight of the skin cluster. So with this controller, IAIM controller selected, we're going to select Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, and load our IAIM controller into the Outputs column. Scroll down until we see Drag. Then select our iDrag cluster. Click on the cluster and the outputs and load that into the inputs of the connection editor. And then connect the drag to the envelope. So now you see we have an envelope of 0. If I go back and select the IAIM controller and move it about, we have no eye drag. If I click on this eye drag attribute, I can slowly add in the amount of eye drag. Let's dial that to 0.2. So we have a much more subtle eye drag. Let's take this down to 0.1. So even more subtle. Zoom in here so we can see it a little better. Just a very subtle eye drag. And it's something that's dialable by the animator. Okay, so there, simply using a cluster, we've added an eye drag onto our character. Once again, very simple control, just adding a cluster and changing the deformation order, and then tying that envelope weight into an attribute on the controller. Once again, it's something that's completely dialable by the animator. They can get as much or as little of the eye drag as they feel they need, or none whatsoever.